Ever notice how a scowling person can make you think angry instantly?
Yeah.
It's like we're wired to read faces as emotion signals.
Definitely, like a universal language of feelings.
But get this, research shows those scowls only match up with actual anger, what people report feeling, less than 30% of the time.
That is interesting.
Like think of a crying baby.
Oh, right.
Sad, hungry, frustrated. We slap these adult labels on them. But is that the whole picture?
Good point. There could be a lot more going on beneath the surface.
You're about to discover a whole new world of how emotions actually work, one that might flip your assumptions upside down.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, where today we're exploring how emotions are made, a book diving deep into the cutting-edge science of feeling.
Sounds fascinating.
Forget those simplistic ideas of emotions as, hardwired reactions. We're going beyond that.
I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Prepare for some serious perspective shifts that could change how you understand your own emotions and everyone else's forever.
Sign me up.
So one of the most mind-blowing things this book tackles is the challenge to this classical view of emotions.
Ah, the classic view.
Right. The idea that each emotion, whether it's joy or sadness or fear, it's got its own dedicated wiring in the brain, its own unique bodily signature.
Like a fingerprint, right?
Right.
Specific changes in your heart rate, your breathing, even those tiny facial muscles.
Exactly. It's this neat little package. Feel joy, boom, specific set of changes happen. But as you dive into this research, the picture gets a lot more complex, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
So let's talk about those supposed fingerprints, those unique physical signatures for each emotion. Does the science actually back that up?
Well, if you look at it closely, the idea of this one-to-one mapping between a single emotion and a specific bodily response, it starts to fall apart.
Really? How so?
Well, take facial expressions, for instance. Studies using electromyography, or EMG, which measures even the tiniest electrical activity in facial muscles.
Wow, getting down to the nitty-gritty.
They show that even when people say they're feeling the same emotion, their facial muscle activity is all over the place. Not consistent at all.
Huh, that's surprising.
And even this super detailed system called FACS, Facial Action Coding System, which categorizes every little twitch and wrinkle you can make with your face.
That sounds incredibly intricate.
It is. Even that system can't consistently link specific facial movements to specific emotions that people are posing.
So our faces are more of a mixed bag than we might think.
Way more expressive and less specific, that's for sure.
You'd think if these emotional fingerprints were so universal, hardwired into us, babies would be the prime example.
Right.
Less time to learn all the social stuff, so their reaction should be pure and clear.
Yeah, you'd expect that.
But then there's this fascinating research with infants that throws a wrench in that whole idea. Remember the study with the growling gorilla toy?
Oh, yeah, the growling gorilla.
Researchers played this sudden, scary gorilla growl to babies, trying to, trigger fear. Then they did another thing, gently restrained the baby's arms.
Ah, creating a bit of frustration, maybe even a little anger.
Right. But here's the kicker. They used FACS to analyze the baby's facial expressions in both situations.
I bet the expressions were wildly different.
You'd think, right. But they were indistinguishable. Same facial movements for both.
Wow. So much for hardwired expressions.
But here's the really cool part. When adults watch videos of these babies, even with the faces blurred out so they couldn't see the expressions, they could often correctly guess which situation the baby was in. Gorilla growl or arm restraint.
No way. So they were picking up on something else, some other cue.
Exactly. They were using context, the situation itself, to figure out what the baby must be feeling. They weren't relying on some universal facial code for fear or anger.
Fascinating. It really highlights how much our brains fill in the blanks based on what makes sense in the moment.
Right. It's not just about reading faces, it's about interpreting the whole situation. And speaking of filling in the blanks, there was this study from back in 1983 that seemed to find some specific bodily changes linked to anger. But even that study had its problems, didn't it?
Yeah, for one thing, those specific responses didn't really hold up for other emotions.
Right. It was kind of a one-hit wonder. And the way they did the study, having participants deliberately pose their faces to show different emotions, that could have actually influenced the physical changes they observed.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially for people from Western cultures who've grown up with these shared understandings of what, say, an angry face looks like.
Yeah.
They might have been reacting to the act of posing, not the genuine feeling itself.
Right. It's like you scrunch up your face, hold your breath, tense your muscles, your heart rate's going to go up, regardless of whether you're truly angry or just pretending.
The book also mentions a follow-up study with the Minangkabau tribe in Indonesia.
Right. A culture with the different ideas about emotions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they didn't show those same distinct physical changes in response to the same situations, and they even reported experiencing the emotions less often.
Huh. So much for universal fingerprints.
It all points to the incredible influence of culture on our emotional experiences.
Now, let's shift gears and talk about the brain. We often hear about specific brain regions being linked to certain emotions, like the amygdala and fear, right?
Right. The classic example.
But the book digs into this case of a woman known as SM who had damage to her amygdala. What did her experience tell us about how the brain constructs fear?
SM's case is really fascinating. She was otherwise intelligent, healthy, but she had this very specific difficulty with fear. She rarely reported feeling scared, even in situations that would terrify most people.
Like what kinds of situations?
I mean, things like encountering snakes, watching horror movies, you name it. And when they showed her pictures of faces with wide eyes, that classic fear expression, she struggled to identify it.
Interesting. But her experience of other emotions was pretty normal.
Totally. Which suggests that while the amygdala is definitely involved in processing fear, it's not the be-all and end-all. Fear isn't this, simple, localized thing in the brain.
Right. It's more complex than just one brain area lighting up. And when you zoom out and look at the big picture, those massive meta-analyses, studies that combine data from tons of other studies,
Right, the really big picture stuff.
they consistently show that what we call anger, fear, and any emotion really, involves this huge range of bodily responses and brain activity patterns, not one single fingerprint.
It's more like a symphony of activity across the brain, right?
As the book uses this idea of degeneracy to explain this, it's like saying many different musicians can play the same note on different instruments.
So different combinations of brain activity can lead to the same emotional experience?
Exactly. Variation is the norm. So when you use a word like sadness, it's not pointing to this fixed, unchanging pattern. It's more of a broad category.
Like different flavors of ice cream, all under the category of ice cream.
I love that analogy. So if emotions don't have these hardwired fingerprints, then how on earth do our brains create them? This is where the book's exploration of the constructionist approach gets really interesting.
Definitely. This flips the script on how we think about emotions.
Yeah.
It says those categories like joy or anger, they don't have pre-existing circuits in the brain waiting to be triggered.
So it's not like flipping a switch.
Not at all. The variability we see, those different flavors of each emotion, those are actually the key. And this whole process relies heavily on something called simulation. Remember those weird black blob pictures?
Oh, yeah, the ones that look like random splotches at first.
Right. But then you're told, hey, this is actually a Dalmatian dog. And suddenly,
boom. You can't unsee the dog. It's like magic.
exactly. Your brain used its past experience of seeing dogs to make sense of those random shapes. It filled in the missing information.
So our brains are constantly predicting and creating, filling in the gaps in our perceptions.
All the time. And it happens without us even realizing it. That's what we mean by simulation. Your brain is changing its own sensory activity based on what it expects. And that dog, it feels totally real, right?
Totally. It's not like you're consciously constructing the image.
And think about having a song stuck in your head.
Oh, the dreaded earworm.
That's simulation too.
Yeah.
That auditory hallucination. It feels real, even though there's no actual music playing externally.
So how does this all connect to emotions?
Well, the idea is that our brains are always predicting the physical sensations associated with different situations based on our past experiences. It's like a dress rehearsal for the real thing.
A dress rehearsal for our feelings.
Exactly. So your brain anticipates, okay, in this situation, my heart might pound, my stomach might clench.
So it's not the sensation itself causing the emotion.
Right. It's more about how our brain interprets those sensations, guided by our past experiences, that shapes the emotional experience. And then there's this whole other layer, concepts.
Right, those mental categories we use to make sense of the world.
Emotion concepts are like the labels we put on those physical sensations. They're not innate. We learn them through our experiences in our culture.
So going back to that racing heart, it's the same physical sensation, but whether you call it excitement or anxiety depends on how your brain is labeling it.
Exactly. And different cultures can have different concepts for the same physical sensations. leading to completely different emotional experiences.
It's like that classic example of how the Inuit have like dozens of words for snow.
Right. They experience snow in a far more nuanced way because their language and culture have provided them with the concepts to do so.
Okay, back to our ice cream analogy.
I'm always up for ice cream.
The concept of ice cream is what lets us lump all those flavors together, right?
Yeah, chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, they're all ice cream.
Similarly, emotion concepts like anger or happiness are like these big umbrellas covering a bunch of different bodily sensations and situations.
And remember, degeneracy at the level of the brain. Different sets of neurons can be involved in creating those different flavors of the same emotion.
Right, it's not just one specific circuit lighting up.
Yeah.
And the book stresses the importance of holism, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
To truly understand emotions, we can't just focus on isolated parts of the brain. It's about seeing how all the pieces, like interoceptions, simulation, and concepts, all work together as a whole.
Now, let's talk about this interoceptive network that the book dives into. What is it and why is it so central to our emotions?
The interoceptive network is like your body's internal sensory system. It's constantly monitoring all those subtle signals from inside your body. Your heartbeat, breathing, digestion, temperature, muscle tension, everything.
Like an internal surveillance system.
In a way, yeah. And it's constantly predicting what your body needs to stay in balance, what the book calls your body budget.
Body budget, huh? That's a cool term.
The primary interoceptive cortex then represents those predictions. So it's like your brain's way of keeping track of all your internal resources and making sure everything's running smoothly.
So how do everyday events, even seemingly neutral ones, become emotionally charged through this network?
They become personally meaningful when they impact your body budget. Remember that example in the book about the grad student whose heart rate spiked whenever their advisor walked into the room?
Yeah, it was like the body was going on high alert.
Exactly. Even though there was no physical exertion, their brain predicted that this social interaction would require resources, leading to that physiological response. It's like their body was preparing for a challenge.
And I remember you mentioned how your own heart rate would jump when you got emails from a certain granting agency.
Oh, yeah. Those emails had big implications for my career, my future. So even though it's just an email, my brain perceived it as a potentially stressful event affecting my body budget.
Fascinating. So our brains are constantly anticipating the demands of different situations, even if they're not physically demanding.
Absolutely. And it's not just real events that can throw off our body budget. Even just imagining a stressful scenario, like a confrontation with your boss or a looming deadline, can trigger similar bodily responses.
We're really good at stressing ourselves out, even in our own minds.
The book points out that we spend a huge chunk of our waking hours in this kind of mental simulation, and it has a very real impact on how we feel.
Speaking of impact, our connections with other people play a huge role in regulating our body budgets, don't they?
A massive role. Close relationships are like these amazing body budget regulators. When we're around people we trust and care about, our bodies tend to sync up. Our breathing, our heartbeats, they start to match.
That's so cool.
Isn't it? Even just holding hands with someone you love or having their picture nearby can reduce activity in those body budgeting regions of the brain and even lessen our perception of pain.
Wow, love really is a powerful drug.
Right. And there's this really interesting study where people perceived a hill as less steep when they were walking with friends. It's like our social connections literally help us share the load.
That makes so much sense. And on the flip side, losing a close relationship can be so devastating because you're essentially losing that external source of regulation for your body budget.
Exactly. It's like suddenly having to carry all that weight yourself.
Now, the book introduces this concept of affect. How does that fit into this whole picture of emotions as constructions?
Affect is basically your core feeling state at any given moment. It's how pleasant or unpleasant you feel and how calm or agitated you feel.
So it's like a two-dimensional spectrum of feeling.
Exactly. Imagine it like a map with two axes. One axis is valence, running from positive to negative, and the other axis is arousal, running from low to high.
So if I'm feeling relaxed and content, that would be low arousal and positive valence.
Right, you got it. And if you're at a party, dancing, and having a blast, that would be high arousal and positive valence.
Makes sense. And our affect is always changing, right?
It's fluid, like water. It can shift as our internal state and the situation around us changes. That fun party might wind down and become boring, shifting your affect to lower arousal.
And even daydreaming, something that seems so passive, involves changes in affect.
Oh, absolutely. Daydreaming is all about simulation and subtle shifts in our interoception, which directly influences our affect.
So it's not just external events that shape our feelings, but also our own internal mental activity.
Exactly. Now, this basic feeling of affect, it's not just something we passively experience. It can actually color how we perceive the world around us.
Okay, tell me more about that. That seems fascinating.
Well, it's this idea called affective realism. When our core affect changes, whether we feel good or bad, calm or agitated, if we're not aware of what's causing that change, we tend to misinterpret that feeling as being about the world around us, rather than recognizing it as our own internal state.
So like projecting our feelings outwards.
Exactly. The book gives some really cool examples, like people tend to report feeling happier and more satisfied with their lives on sunny days, but that effect goes away if you ask them about the weather beforehand. It's like the good feeling from the sunshine gets unconsciously mixed up with their overall life satisfaction.
So it's not really about their life being better, it's about their mood being influenced by the weather.
Precisely. And interviewers might rate job candidates lower on rainy days, even though the weather has nothing to do with the candidate's qualifications.
Wow, that's kind of unfair.
It is.
Yeah.
And if a friend snaps at you, their bad mood might be from something totally unrelated to you, but you might interpret it as them being annoyed with you specifically.
Ah, so effective realism can lead to misunderstandings.
Definitely. And what's important here is that an unpleasant image, for example, isn't inherently unpleasant in some objective way. It's unpleasant because it affects your body budget in a way that you experience as unpleasant.
Right, so our feelings can become our reality.
Exactly. And lab experiments have shown that if you manipulate someone's affect, you can actually influence how they perceive a stranger's face. Whether they see them as trustworthy, competent, likable, all of that can change based on their current mood.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So basically, our decisions, our perceptions, even our actions, they're all influenced by our internal state, whether we realize it or not.
The book argues that we can never truly separate ourselves from our feelings.
Now, let's delve a bit deeper into concepts, those mental categories we were talking about earlier. The book highlights that concepts are often goal-based. What does that mean in everyday life?
Well, it means that we often group things together, not because they look alike or have similar physical properties, but because they help us achieve a particular goal. The example in the book is things that can protect you from stinging insects.
Okay, that's a good one.
This category might include a net, a can of insect repellent, and wearing long sleeves. They're all totally different things, but they're linked in our minds because they all serve the same purpose.
Right, they all help you avoid getting stung.
Exactly.
And how do we learn these concepts, especially abstract ones like emotions? The book touches on the idea of statistical learning in language development. How does that work?
It's like a hidden code-breaking system in our brains. Babies listen to us talk, this constant stream of sounds, and without even realizing it, they track which sounds tend to go together.
They're like little statisticians.
It is pretty amazing. And this helps them figure out where the boundaries between words are. It's so powerful that it actually changes the way their brains are wired, making them better at processing their native language.
So our brains are constantly picking up patterns and making connections, even from a very young age.
Exactly. And the book argues that we learn about emotions in a similar way through repeated exposure to emotion words used in specific situations.
So if you constantly hear the word angry when someone is yelling, their face is red, their fists are clenched, you start to connect all those sensory details with that word and what it represents.
Exactly. The emotion word acts like this anchor point, helping us to group similar experiences together, even if they're different in some ways.
And the book points out that little kids don't really get those nuanced emotion concepts until they're around 3 years old. Before that, they might use words like sad, scared, and mad almost interchangeably.
It's like they have this general sense of bad or unpleasant, but the finer distinctions haven't fully developed yet.
Right, those more complex emotional concepts take time and experience to solidify. And then there's this idea of conceptual combination, which sounds super interesting. Can you break that down for us?
Conceptual combination is our brain's awesome ability to take concepts we already have and combine them in new ways to create totally new concepts.
So like taking building blocks and making new structures.
Precisely. It's like having an unlimited supply of Legos. This is how we understand new ideas and experiences, including complex emotions. But having a specific word for a combined concept makes it so much easier to think about and communicate. The book calls this the pizza effect.
The pizza effect.
It's so much faster to say pizza than to describe every single ingredient, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Similarly, having words for emotions streamlines our thinking and communication.
Like shorthand for our feelings.
Exactly. And even before babies can talk, their brains are already doing this kind of conceptual categorization. Then words come along and help make those categories even stronger.
So language is a powerful tool.
Hugely powerful. And this brings us back to emotional granularity.
Right, you were talking about that earlier. Can you remind us what that means?
Emotional granularity is basically how detailed and nuanced your emotional vocabulary is, and how specific your underlying emotion concepts are. Someone with high emotional granularity can tell the difference between feeling irritated, frustrated, aggravated, resentful, enraged.
Whoa, that's a lot of shades of angry.
Exactly. They're like an emotion expert, able to pinpoint the subtle differences. Someone with low emotional granularity might just have a few broad categories where lots of different feelings get lumped together.
So the richer your emotional vocabulary, the better you understand your own feelings and the feelings of others. And the book really challenges this classic stimulus-response idea of emotions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The idea that we just automatically react to the world with pre-programmed emotional responses, it's way too simplistic.
So it's not like something happens and we instantly feel a certain way.
Our brains are much more sophisticated than that. They're constantly predicting and categorizing incoming information based on what we've learned in the past. And a lot of this happens beneath the surface of our awareness.
Like with that snake in the woods example.
Perfect example. You don't stop and think, is this a dangerous snake? Okay, now I should feel fear.
You just react.
Your brain instantly recognizes the potential danger based on past associations, and it triggers that whole cascade of fear responses. Heart racing, adrenaline pumping, all of that.
It's almost like our brain has a shortcut system for dealing with potential threats.
It does. And it's all about survival. Now, this concept of emotions being perceiver-dependent is a real game changer.
I'm all ears. Explain that one.
Imagine a flower.
Okay, I'm picturing a beautiful rose.
Now imagine a weed.
Ugh, dandelions popping up in my lawn.
A botanist might classify them based on, like, their biological traits, but whether we call something a flower or a weed often depends on our own perspective, our goals, the context.
Right, like a rose in a garden is lovely, but in a wheat field, it's a problem.
Exactly. The plant itself exists subjectively, but the category we put it in depends on us, the perceiver. And the book argues that emotions work similarly. While the physical changes in our bodies are real, heart rate increasing, hormones being released, all that, they only become instances of a specific emotion like fear or excitement when our brains categorize them using our learned concepts.
So without those mental frameworks, those labels, it's just raw physical stuff happening.
Exactly. It doesn't inherently mean anything emotionally until our brain interprets it.
So emotions are like co-creations between our bodies and our brains, shaped by our individual experiences and our culture.
You nailed it. It's a dynamic interplay.
And this brings us to the social dimension of emotions. These categories, they don't just exist in our heads. They have power because of our shared understanding.
Absolutely. That's the middle ground the book highlights.
Yeah.
Emotion categories, they might not be hardwired, but they're not random or meaningless either. They gain real power through social reality. The shared concepts, beliefs, and language that shape our collective understanding.
Right. It's like money or the idea of a nation state. These are made-up concepts, but they have huge consequences in the real world.
Exactly. And emotion concepts, we learn them, we transmit them through words, and they create this mental similarity between people. This allows us to understand each other, predict each other's behavior, coordinate our actions.
Makes sense. And the book outlines 5 key functions these emotion concepts serve.
Okay, let's run through those. First, they help us make sense of all those raw signals coming from our bodies. Second, they guide our actions based on our goals in a given situation. Third, the act of categorizing those internal states actually helps regulate our body budget.
So those first 3 are about our individual experience.
Right. Then the fourth function is all about communication. When 2 or more people categorize a situation and their feelings in a similar way, boom, you've got shared understanding, connection.
And finally, emotions as tools of social influence.
Exactly. We can use them to regulate other people's body budgets by communicating our own perceived emotional state. Like a frown might signal disapproval, for example.
Nonverbal cues.
Powerful stuff. Now, remember that chiplessness example from the book?
Oh yeah, the feeling you get when you reach into a bag of chips.
And it's just crumbs. That specific flavor of disappointment and mild distress.
We've all been there, but we don't really have a word for it.
Exactly. It highlights how we can combine existing concepts to create new emotional experiences. If we all agreed to call that chiplessness, it would become a shared concept, influencing how we experience similar situations in the future.
So words matter. Having a concept, having a label for an emotion can actually shape how we feel it.
Absolutely. The book uses the example of Lijit from the Ilongot tribe. It's this feeling of like exuberant aggression in a specific social context.
And without that cultural concept, someone outside that tribe might experience similar bodily sensations, but wouldn't understand the full meaning attached to them.
It's like being emotionally colorblind.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. Now, the book also delves into the
essentialism, when it comes to emotions, is this deep-seated belief that each emotion has a fixed underlying essence, like a specific circuit in the brain, a unique pattern of bodily changes, a universal facial expression. Happiness has a happiness signature, and so on.
And we often operate under this assumption without even realizing it, right?
It's so ingrained in our thinking. And the book talks about how even Charles Darwin, who revolutionized biology by challenging the idea of fixed essences in species, he seemed to fall back into essentialist thinking when he wrote about emotions.
So even brilliant minds can get stuck in these old ways of thinking.
It's hard to break free from those deeply ingrained assumptions. And then there's William James, considered the father of modern psychology.
Right. He's often cited as a proponent of this essentialist view, saying each emotion has its own distinct bodily feeling.
The famous quote, "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble."
But the book offers a different interpretation of his work, doesn't it?
It does. James actually argued that each individual instance of an emotion, not each broad category, has a unique bodily signature. So your fear of a spider and your fear of public speaking, those might involve different bodily sensations, even though we lump them both under fear.
So it's about variability within those broad categories.
Exactly. It's the classical view that twisted his ideas into this, like, one emotion, one fingerprint thing.
The book also talks about the case of Broca's area in the brain and the rise of behaviorism as examples related to this essentialism versus constructionism debate.
Right. So Broca's area, for a long time, people thought it was the language center of the brain. But it turns out it's much more complex than that.
Just like emotions.
Exactly. Language and emotions, they involve these complex networks, not just single locations in the brain. And behaviorism, it was this movement in psychology that basically ignored inner experience, focusing only on observable behavior.
Like ignoring the black box of the mind altogether.
Yeah, I was like saying, if we can't see it and measure it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But that completely sidestepped the richness and complexity of our emotional lives.
So understanding this constructed nature of emotions, it's not just theoretical, it has real implications for our well-being, doesn't it?
Huge implications. The book makes a strong case for that.
Like, what are some practical things we can do to, I don't know, influence our own emotional experiences?
Well, first and foremost, tend to your body budget.
Right. Take care of the physical basics.
Getting enough sleep, eating well, exercising, all those things have a direct impact on how we feel.
It's like laying a good foundation for a house.
Exactly. And then there's emotional granularity. The book encourages us to cultivate a richer vocabulary for our emotions.
So expanding our emotional toolbox.
Precisely. Learn new emotion words, pay attention to the subtle differences in how you feel. Maybe keep a journal where you try to describe your positive experiences in more detail.
So it's about becoming more aware of the nuances of our own feelings.
And when talking to kids, using a wider range of emotion words can really help them develop their own emotional intelligence.
Makes sense. We can shape their understanding of emotions by giving them the words to describe them.
Exactly. It's also important to remember that a physical sensation doesn't automatically equal a specific emotion. We have the power to reinterpret those sensations.
So that pounding heart and shortness of breath, it could be anxiety or it could be excitement, depending on the context and how you choose to label it.
Right. And the book touches on this concept of deconstructing the self, a Buddhist-inspired idea about learning to observe your thoughts and sensations with more detachment.
So not getting so caught up in the story, our minds are telling us about those sensations.
Exactly. And practices like mindfulness meditation can be really helpful in cultivating that kind of non-judgmental awareness. Studies have shown that meditation can actually change the structure and function of the brain in areas related to interoception and self-awareness.
That's incredible. It's like we can rewire our brains to experience emotions differently.
In a way, yes. And, you shared that great anecdote in the book about those crickets at the beach house.
Oh, yeah, that one.